Listen to the Word of God from St. Luke, 10th chapter, verses 38 to 42. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." The end of the word of the Lord Jesus Christ.
If you will sing from your hymnal, hymn number 175, and stand and sing "Seek Ye First," we'll sing all three verses.
I know we've said good morning many times to everybody on one-on-one, and I'd like to say again good morning to you all. And this is a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to be here and express my appreciation. And that's what it is. It is appreciation for all that we have here as individuals who come collectively together to learn about the Word of God, but not only to learn, but hopefully to apply so that we can go on living in our Christian world. As is my normal custom for some of you who know my MO, so to speak, in the classroom, I usually start out with a nice little story. And I'm not going to let you down this time. At least I hopefully will not let you down. You know, physicals are generally a part of our normal life nowadays. And this one gentleman who had his physical, he was in the doctor's office, and this is essentially the interchange between the doctor and the patient, so to speak. The doctor asked me about my physical activity for the day, and I described the typical day yesterday. Well, yesterday afternoon, I took a 5-hour walk, about 4 miles, through some pretty tough terrain. I waded along the edge of a lake. I pushed my way through brambles. I got sand in my shoes, eyes, and hair. Avoided standing on a snake. I climbed several rocky hills. I took a few reliefs behind some big trees. The mental stress of it just left me totally wiped out. At the end of it all, I drank 8 beers. Inspired by the story, the doctor said, "You must be one heck of an outdoorsman." "No," I replied, "I'm just a lousy golfer." I know some of you can relate to that. And you know, as I said, this is a heck of an opportunity for me. I'm not going to preach, per se. I'm not a preacher in that sense of the word. And I don't know the Bible as well as I would like to, but that's essentially why I volunteered to continue teaching. And it's a learning process for me personally. And I admit to selfishness in that respect, to being able to use that to hopefully help my journey through a Christian life. I hope you'll sort of forgive me in the sense that I'm not going to preach and a normal sermon from that point of view. This is going to be largely personal. And it's largely personal because I think I'm fairly unique in the sense of our demographics here, because I don't know how many Armenians have been a part of this church. I've been here since 1977, and I think I've only had one attendant other than myself. And I know within the WASP community, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, there isn't too much knowledge of what Armenians are all about. So I thought I would take some of this time to enlighten you as well as myself, because I constantly need appraisals of myself to see where I am, what I'm doing, and what I have to be thankful for. You know, I'm just kind of curious, how many of you know what Armenians are? Can I just have a raise of hands? Doug? Beautiful. Susan there? Okay. What are they? Well, I'll give you a start. The Armenians were the very first country in the world, in our civilization, to accept Christianity as a religion. That goes back to 301 AD. The disciples Thaddeus and Bartholomew went through Armenia. Armenia is a country located right now. It's independent. It's gone through many cycles of history, and it's now an independent country, Eastern Turkey. And it had its own little empires throughout history. It's always been a battle, but it's kept one basic point. It's been a Christian nation throughout its entire history, relating from 301 AD. I've got to take a little exception. There was a period in about 500 or 600 AD where the Persians got after them, and it got to be a battle. And that's a continuous battle throughout the old world, so to speak. What is even a battle now? Muslims, particularly Muslims, against the Christian world. And we see it now. I don't know if it will ever end. But I do want to take this time just to kind of give you the highlights of it, to give you the feel for what it is, and the depth of our Christian beliefs. The early part of the Armenians, as they got started, they went through many of the cycles that we all do present time. The ups and downs of the Christian battles that go on inside. At one time, the kingdom of Armenia, there was a kingdom there, was larger than Turkey itself right now in the early history period in there. And they have their own, I'd want to say religion, but it has its own denomination in the Christian world. It's called the Armenian Apostolic Church. Sorry. And the church itself has its own liturgy. It's independent. In other words, it's a declaration of independence. That's one thing that has been outstanding. It developed its own language. A little in the year 400, it developed its own language. And once you develop your own language as a society and as a civilization, then other things begin to fall in place. But that theology and that way of life is something that has been carried on and throughout the entire history of the Armenians, as they are, and dispersed around the world. And I'll just briefly mention how, why they got put apart. All of their beliefs, they're martyrs, literally martyrs, much like the Christian life of all the other Christians, went through this episodes of dying for Christ and having to fight literally against the other beliefs, particularly the Muslim world. It was really, really tough. I have a very personal relationship in that respect. I'm a first generation here in this country of Armenians and of ones who've come through the survival. I don't know if, again, I'm sorry, I'm in a classroom, so to speak, and I use this. How many of you have heard of the Armenian genocide? 1, 2, yeah. My grandson, you'd better be. But the Armenian genocide was a historical moment in modern day Armenia. And my parents were a direct result of that genocide. I'm the only survivor who was born in this country of those survivors. So I'm the first generation of that lot. And my mother, who was 12 years old when she started the journey of the genocide. What happened back there was that the Armenians were set apart in different parts, particularly in Turkey. And there were various communities. There was an Armenian community. There were other smaller communities that were interspersed. There were a few Muslims occasionally. The Turks, beginning about the mid-1800s, started a, if you will, a philosophy of their own to establish the Muslim religion as pretty much unique to them. And they began a culture in which they started recruiting, if that's the right word for it. It was more like conscripting, particularly the men, for the Turkish army. And once you got the Turkish army, you were a Muslim. And once a Muslim, always a Muslim. The penalty for ever declaring that you're not a Muslim is death. That's it. There's no way out. Throughout that span, my grandfather on my mother's side left and emigrated to this country in 1912. And they found a location in one of the little small suburbs, a company town, a place called Caryville, Wisconsin, just outside of Milwaukee, one of the suburbs. Milwaukee isn't, or wasn't then, at that time, the city it is now. It was very diversified, cultural, pretty much Lutheran-based city in a sense of a basic religion. And a small, I almost put it in a classification of a missionary community. A mother, a family was living right there in Caryville who somewhat recruited us. It was a company town. If you can imagine Tennessee Ernie's song about a company town. I don't know if you remember Tennessee Ernie Ford. But the company town is what I lived in, what we grew up in. It was a benevolent town in the sense that the corporation was recruiting immigrants. And so my grandfather came from there, or went there, and worked in the company town. And the man who became my father later on was brought by my grandfather back in. And he was betrothed to my mother when she was just a child back in the old country in this small city. So my grandfather somewhat was aware of that, and he sent my father back to get my father-to-be. What was interesting was that this was about the 1911 period, and the Turks began their real enforcement of the Muslim domination by around 1915 is pretty much a declaration of day. April 24th, 1915 is recognized as the day that the Armenians used to commemorate the genocide. And that's what it was. There wasn't any question about it. The genocide, that genocide, the Armenian genocide, is studied, has been the most studied genocide next to the Holocaust, in the sense of a Muslim community, country, government, taking over and declaring a total enforcement of departing or separating themselves and forcing the people out of their villages and confiscating their property, and literally confiscating them. My mother would tell me stories about that, and I was pretty young at the time, and I never could really comprehend them. But the stories she told me were something, I was pretty much of an adolescent, and I didn't really understand much of that. An interesting document just came to light here about 2 years ago. My daughter, who lives here in town, found an interview of my mother and her life during the genocide. And the genocide in that time frame consisted of, from their perspective, in fact it was, of a forced departure from their village. They were told that, hey, you're going to get your property back. We want you to sign off your property to us, but you're going to get it back when you come back. And they were told, that's what they were told when they got out. My mother started with 4 sisters. She ended up with 2 sisters. They marched, literally, through hunger, starvation, and many of those things that refugees go through, but some of it was totally unbelievable. It was a little unbelievable to me as a youngster, not really recognizing what it was. But that interview, she gave such a clear picture of what it's like to literally starve and to just subsist. And she had her mother. Her father was, of course, in this country. And my grandfather then found out that they were alive through an Armenian newspaper, English newspaper, found their name at a refugee camp in Syria. They walked and marched through about 250 miles from south central Turkey through various Syrian, particularly what is now known as Syria. And only really as of late have I really began to understand the depth of that journey. And to see, it's hard to talk about it in these terms here, about those things. But the thing that held them together, and this is the part of the whole process to me, was their religion and the belief in God, that somehow or other they would go through. My mother lost 2 sisters through starvation in that march. And my father, when he went over there, and fortunately was united with her, got married in Beirut, 1922. And it makes me appreciate so much more that we have here in this country. And I'll tell you, it makes me appreciate the work that many of the other American missionaries did over there at the time. I could go on and talk a lot more. And one thing I promised Dave, I would not go on and talk too long up here. But I am taking exception in the sense that I'm up here on the podium and I got a captive audience. So I hope you'll forgive me if it does stretch itself a little too far from me. Well, I've constantly stressed on the Christian side of it. But there is this animosity. In last Sunday's sermon, I feel a little bit of a guilt in the sense that how can I bridge that gap somehow? The Muslims in that world, there was no question about trying to accommodate them. You could not. There wasn't any accommodation. There was not only a forced departure. Mind you, when those people were on the march, there was no food, there was no drink. Everything was scavenged from the earth, from the animals, from all of the stuff that was on the ground. That was the only way they could survive. The Arabs, my mother would say, the Arabs were the best friends that she ever had. She started when she was 12 years old, and when they finished the march, she was around 18, 19 years old at the time. So all those years, she survived as a child in scraping through those little things that you'd ordinarily do and live just to get along. So, a long history of the Armenians. I just want to comment one more thing about it. Right now, I saw that only a few of you understand what the Armenians like. How many of you know what the Church of the Sepulchre is? The Church of the Sepulchre. What we have? The Church of the Sepulchre is the tomb of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. It's recognized as a tomb there. And the Jews don't recognize it as Jesus Christ. But it's the tomb of Jesus Christ. And an interesting thing about that is that there are three primary denominations that are involved in the ownership of the church. The Greek Orthodox, the Catholics, and the Armenians. There are only three basic denominations that are heavily involved in the ownership of that church, and that's Jesus' tomb inside the walls of Old Jerusalem. That's probably the most revered site of most of the hierarchy, so to speak, of the denominations themselves. And the interesting thing about that, how does that relate to our attempt, and I say attempt, an accommodation to live with the Muslims? Because right now, we have what I term as a politically correct definition of radical Islams. It's hard for me personally to feel like somehow or other the Muslims in this world now are really interested in accommodating themselves to the Christian world. I'm sorry, I have a very difficult time in trying to rationalize that. But I look back, in the final years of my mother's life, she told me, John, she said, Johnny, she said, why don't the Armenians and the Turks get together? Quit the animosity, because they've never forgotten it. Never. To this day, there is this constant battle. In the mid-1700s is when they came to a treaty with respect to the Church of the Sepulchre. And they had a treaty signed by these three basic denominations which set the church ownership in place. And I found something in that church ownership issue. I went through the documents, and I don't like to read from a paper, but there was something in that church right now, and I thought it was very fitting that might help us bridge some of this. In my Christian beliefs as well, I know who is your neighbor is always out in front of us. And from that perspective, you look for some ways of getting together. That's what everybody in this world is coming to now, is trying to find some ways. And there's something within that church I read that really brings it, I think, symbolizes what might be a way. I'll read from this. Each religious community guards its rights jealously. The often uneasy relationship laid down by the status quo is typified by a wooden ladder resting on a cornice above the main entrance and leaning against a window ledge inside the church itself. The ladder has been there so long that nobody knows how it got there. Various suggestions have been offered. It was left behind by a careless mason or window cleaner. It had been used to supply food to the Armenian monks locked in the church by the Turks. It had served to let the Armenians use the cornice as a balcony to get fresh air and sunshine rather than leave the church and pay an Ottoman tax to re-enter it. The ladder appears in an engraving of the church dated 1728, and it was mentioned in the 1757 edict by Sultan Abdul Hamid I that became the basis for what's called the status quo. That's the treaty that keeps those together. It would be too much to expect that the ladder seen today has resisted the elements since early in the 18th century. In fact, the original has been replaced. In 1997, the ladder suddenly disappeared for some weeks after a Protestant prankster hid it behind an altar. When it was discovered in return, a steel grate was installed over the lower parts of the windows above the entrance. And in 2009, the ladder mysteriously appeared against the left window for a day, where it now stands. And it's kind of typical, that ladder somewhat symbolizes maybe there's a way of climbing and using that symbol to bring us together. I will sort of finish my short talk here. I hope it was short. I lost track of the time. I hope you didn't, Dave. But I just want to put it, again, this is my prerogative of being up here, right? I can say anything I want to. Just a personal note, because it's part of my Christian journey. If it weren't for Roberta, I wouldn't be here. About 4 months ago, I got word that the cancer that I've been fighting for 6 years has now gotten into my bone marrow. So the obvious question that you ask a doctor is, well, how long do I have it? Well, he said, you don't know. Doctors don't know. And I've got about a year. He said, I'll give you about a year or so. My point is, please, I'm not looking for any kind of pity or any kind of token kind of saying, oh, John, so sad. It is not sad. I've lived a wonderful life. I've had a wonderful family relationship. I've had a wonderful life primarily because of the Christian life. And I hope and pray that it will pass its way down to the family, to the rest of my family, and to those deep beliefs, whether they be Armenian, Protestant, Methodist, or what have you. That basic belief comes down and starts right there, and hope it never ends. And I hope it never ends for you just as well. Thank you.